For me, writing about hip-hop began when an editor walked into my cubicle when I started at Forbes in 2007. And she said, "Do you like hip-hop? You're under 30. And I said, it's the easiest question of my life. Yes, of course I like hip-hop. I love hip-hop. I'm one of these people who, like the Halsey song, was raised on Biggie and Nirvana. It was the soundtrack to my youth. And I think really it's a soundtrack to a generation that doesn't look like or sound like any one type of person or place, and really is truly, truly diverse. So yeah, I said to her, of course, I would love to be involved in this project. What it ended up being was the first ever list of top earning rappers in the world. I did a story on Tupac Shakur and how he was making more money dead at that time than all but a few living rappers. The number 3 top earning living rappers at the time were Jay-Z and Diddy, who continue to be in that role now, and 50 Cent, who does not. But anyway, the 3 of them got together. They made a song called the Forbes 123 I Get Money $1 Billion Remix. And it ended up on the radio. And my colleagues and I started to hear it, and we thought, I think we're onto something here. Also, we started to think that business journalism was a lot cooler than we'd ever possibly imagined. And basically after that, my editor left, and she said, you should take this and make it your thing. And so I did. And so over the past decade, I've helped Forbes push out our annual Hip Hop Cash Kings package. I've expanded into other areas of hip hop. We've put Jay-Z on the cover, 50 Cent, A$AP Rocky. We've continued to cover hip hop in the way that we might cover, the railroad business or pharmaceuticals or something, because that's what it is. It's a business. It's a global, multi-billion-dollar business, and it deserves to be covered with the seriousness of any business, and that's what we've been trying to do. So I came to kind of the context of hip hop in a really weird way, and that was by studying classics as a freshman at Yale. I was reading Plato and Aristotle and so forth in the Western canon, and became so bored with hearing the same thing over and over again that I went as far as I could in the opposite direction, and that led me to urban studies and American studies. And reading books like The Power Broker and The Truly Disadvantaged, learning about urban renewal and the built environment, and how people like Robert Moses, the master planner of New York City, looked up to somebody like Le Corbusier, who was also admired by the apartheid government in South Africa, and who used some of the very same methods to drive communities of color apart, to rip up neighborhoods and kind of corral people into bleak housing projects. And that landscape is really what hip-hop came out of in the South Bronx in the early 1970s. And all of this kind of started to come together in my head as I studied it and formed the context for my coverage for Forbes going forward. So earlier this year, when we did our 10th annual Hip Hop Cash Kings package, I took it back to the Bronx, and we went with the Forbes video crew, and we did a mini documentary on the founding of hip-hop and the framework of this multi-billion-dollar global business. We talked to guys like Grand Wizard Theodore and Grandmaster Caz, and one of the most interesting people we spoke with was Rocky Bucano, who may be in the audience today. And that was how I got linked up with this event today, and with Mike and Bryan. And what Rocky's doing is putting together the Universal Hip Hop Museum, which we're going to hear a little bit more about in a moment. The Universal Hip Hop Museum is a way for hip hop to tell its story. And the old saying goes, the winners get to write history. Hip hop has won. All you need to do is look around at our culture, look at the movies, look at the fashion, look at the liquor shelves. These are all artifacts of hip hop and the result of this broad-based culture. And the Universal Hip Hop Museum is going to be a way for hip hop to finally tell that story. But that's just one part of the interaction between hip hop and the built environment, and really the fabric of our country. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike and Bryan to tell you a little bit more about that, and then we're going to take your questions. So, ladies and gentlemen.
So my name is Bryan Lee, as the signs said a little bit earlier. What I want to talk to you today is a little bit about design justice and its interconnections with hip hop at large. We're going to talk a little bit about institutions of oppression to start. What I would like to bring up is how we got to a place in which hip hop can even be created It's through 150 years of injustices that have been covert and overt over that time. Institutions of oppression like HUD, Robert Weaver Building, which is the Housing and Urban Development Corporation, Housing and Urban Development Organization, right? So design justice, what is design justice? Design justice advocates for the elimination of privilege and power structures that use design and architecture and planning to basically disenfranchise people across this nation. What we're asking for is how do we eliminate those power structures and how do we use architecture as the language in which we do that? What does it look like? So I'm going to give you a few examples. It looks like the preservation of buildings that have historic significance for African Americans or people of color across this country. This is a project I was working on in Louisiana, which is one of the Rosenwald schools, which was one of thousands and thousands of schools that used a community engagement strategy that had neighborhoods pitching in money, major corporations, and state funding. What it did was provide schooling for young African Americans in communities that historically have been disinherited from the process of planning, but more specifically around education. So how do you actually restore and keep those spaces intact and propel them into the future with some substance behind them? The renovation starts to take place and turns this space into a museum and allows for that space to carry on that message for a long time into the future. It can also look like this. So design justice doesn't necessarily only have to be about the built space itself. About a year ago, I had the pleasure to be with an organization that now calls itself Take 'Em Down NOLA. There are symbols of oppression in our environment that exist and have existed for centuries. Decades, centuries. This happens to be one of them. This is the Robert E. Lee Memorial in the center of New Orleans. Now, this project was a way in which we pulled designers, activists, artists into place and said, how do we actually have an intervention in space that has an impact on not only the people that have the immediate care for this situation, but for those globally around our city, but globally around the nation that have to deal with oppression in many, many ways. And so what we did is we set up ways in which we can project on all sides of this particular monument exactly who Robert E. Lee was. If you don't know, you should look it up. I only got 15 minutes, so I'm not deep diving for you. So what that means is that we take activists and artists, like I said, creatives, community members, who are usually out in the streets. These are the people who march in your streets, who shut down your traffic, right? For your little bit of inconvenience that you have, is really so that we can call attention to the oppressions that have been existing for hundreds of years. And so if the 5 minutes you have to stay in traffic is a problem, read a book and try to understand where the bigger problems are, right? That's what we ask. So here's the point. Culture is an evolutionary act. It requires, so culture is the consequence of persistent circumstance and immediate conditions. It makes it a revolutionary act. It makes it the way in which we speak through the complexities of our built world. This is Mardi Gras morning. So this is a space that historically, about 50 years ago, a highway was built through New Orleans, through a historically black neighborhood like your city, your city, your city, your city. It's kind of happened all over the place, right? But what happened with the culture actually filled in the gaps. This thing ripped a scar through a neighborhood that had economics, that had schools, that had ways in which they could propel itself, right? So when this happens, when you tear a community, the fabric of a community apart, what do? Your culture has to be the thing that persists. And that's what happened. Mardi Gras in New Orleans, if you haven't been there, you should come. If you only stay in the French Quarter, shame on you. Come see us in other times, other spaces. But it fills in. So underneath the bridge, we have a brass band culture in New Orleans. We end up using that as a boombox for the city, right? So the culture fills in the spaces where the social and the physical do not align and attempt to oppress us in ways that we can't fathom. That's what it's there for. I always say architecture is the hardware to the software of life, and our culture is the user interface, right? So they are inextricably linked. A lot of designers, a lot of architects, we tend to get to a point where we say, well, you know what, architecture stands on its own, and that's the thing that it does, and everybody else will have to figure out how they weave into it. It's bullshit. Excuse me, can I say that? I don't know. Yeah. Ugh, it happened. So it's inextricably linked. You don't have a choice. And so when you make decisions as designers, as architects, as planners, when you make those decisions without regard to culture, you are condemning us to consistent oppression over many more years than you will be in that seat. So think about that as designers. When you go out there and you make decisions for a community, you have to think about its culture, because those are the people who are going to carry it through in perpetuity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got here from a global standpoint, from our laws, our codes. Architecture itself has power, and I wanted to make sure that we bring this to light, right? Architecture is an institution, and like all institutions, it uses its power, its procedures and policies to, again, overtly, covertly oppress those who have been disinherited from that system. And so it's in small ways, but I love this picture. These are two pictures from Gordon Parks, famous photographer from the Civil Rights era. The colored entrance sign. This is a beautiful sign. Like, somebody took craft, an artisan took craft to put into this, neglecting the overall oppressive nature of what that design meant. And that was just his job. And so you can say to me, it's just your job. You can say that, but it's more than that. And you know it's more than that. You just have to be willing to face that, right? Okay. So until we are able to, as designers, as planners, as coders, as human beings, deal with our Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction past, we won't be able to actively rid ourselves of these injustices. We have to face them down. We have to face them down in our political lives, but we also have to face them down in our lives that deal with the physical world and in the built environment. So one of the things that came out of Reconstruction, we all know the Black Codes, right? It stemmed from codes and laws before, got into Black Codes, and Black Codes really shaped the way people moved socially through environments and restricted those opportunities for people. The growth of that then came to Jim Crow laws. Now, Jim Crow had a bunch of etiquette considerations as well, right? How you shake hands with certain people, how you are able to move through certain environments. But specifically, Jim Crow focused on the separation and segregation of people in spaces, public spaces specifically. Public spaces are the most democratic places that we can, as human beings, activate. And so when you strip that away from a people continually, century after century, and you don't deal with the ramifications of that, you end up with the problems that we face today. You end up with those problems. And this is a sign from 1964. We are living in a police state. It can be a sign from last week, right? So what happens with those codes? One of the major things that came out of Jim Crow and the Black Codes was this ambiguous law around vagrancy and really loitering, right? Those things really allowed for police to actively persecute people of color, to actively dispense of people in place and jail and rough them up in those particular spaces, which made those spaces unsafe ultimately. And we're talking about how you create safer, more just spaces. You cannot have unsafe spaces. Specifically for these two young men. Last year, Eric Gardner, in front of a convenience store with a cigarette, told the entire world I can't breathe, selling cigarettes. Now I have cousins, I have uncles, I have been in front of these convenience stores. This is a safe space, some might consider it. But this man was choked out. Alton Sterling, in front of us. This man sold CDs in front of this convenience store for all of 5 years. Shot, murdered, in front of his safe space. And so the safe space, the space no longer becomes not only safe for these two men. That was a problem. But it becomes unsafe for anybody else who found comfort in that space. Now the big dog, right? HUD, FHA, 1937, 40s, 50s, 60s, passing laws that dealt with low interest loans and the insurance mapping of our cities. If you don't know about redlining, you should. I'll wait 5 minutes if you want to go out, look it up real quick and come back in. I won't do that, just playing. But the Federal Housing Authority set these laws in place that essentially said, these places are not worth insuring. These places are not worth loaning money to. And when you do that, you create this perpetual system that makes certain neighborhoods less value, takes away equity, takes away ownership, takes away the mechanisms through which we, as a nation, have built our own wealth. And so when we talk about wealth disparities in America, when we talk about salary gaps, salary gaps have shortened between people of color and the majority culture in this country, but wealth in general has not. Guess why? Because of this. You're not going to guess. It's this. It's definitely this. So the point is that these spaces that over time were systemically removed from the ability to gain wealth and equity. There was a 15% gain between the late 30s and the early 80s in equity and specifically for homeowners over that time. None of that went to people of color. Very little of it went to people of color. I don't want to say none or all. So the last thing within that spectrum that kind of talks about how we got where we are is the riots in 1968. Now, there was 125 cities over that time that ended up having some sort of civil unrest. That's burning houses, that's people marching, so on and so forth. The National Guard was sent to a number of cities to kind of quell some of the violence that was happening during that time. Now, this is in reaction to Martin Luther King's assassination. This is in reaction to hundreds of years of oppression that had finally come to a head. During that same year, one of the reasons that we're even here today, and one of the reasons that I travel to a lot of places and speak at these types of conferences is because of this man here, Whitney M. Young. So Whitney M. Young, I accidentally put a filter on this, so it's a slow fade and back in. You like that? So Whitney M. Young had two quotes that I want to read to you specifically. When you go to a city, Champaign-Urbana, the University of Illinois is about the only major institution, and within 2 or 3 blocks are some of the worst slums I have seen in this country. It is amazing how you, within a stone's throw of a school of architecture, have absolutely complete indifference. Now, that's exactly what I felt when I went through architecture school. There was no caring about this. And so let's not act as though we have made all the progress in the world, because we haven't. There are those of us in this room. There are those of us who talk about this consistently. We talk to ourselves a lot about this, but it's our job when we talk about design justice to perpetuate this out into the world, right? The second quote, as a profession, you are not a profession that has distinguished yourself by your social and civic contributions to the cause of civil rights. You are most distinguished by your thunderous silence and complete irrelevance. Damn, like that's rough. And really, when you think about this, this conversation has been happening since 1968. This was at the AIA in Portland in '68, and a lot of public interest design, community engaged design work happened as a result of this, and the 16-page white paper that came from this. So colloquial design. What is colloquial design? So colloquial design, as I've defined it, is really a response. So what does design justice as a movement look like? It looks like us actively using our skill set as designers to affect change in the communities that we serve. Colloquial design is really about understanding the sophisticatedly informal use of formal space to a formal architectural precedent to create spaces of racial and cultural equity, right? So it relies on a few different things, and it really relies on an understanding of those communities you serve. Now, let's be real with ourselves when we talk about specific communities. If you don't know that community and you're just going to go in and think that community engagement alone is going to be the end-all be-all or the answer for you, it will not. You need the expertise, the PhDs who live on a block. That's who you talk to. You can't skip that. No matter how you look at it, you can't skip it. So you need to understand what are the functional needs and necessities for those people in this community. Those things: shelter, food, education, healthcare, safety, commerce, entertainment, public space. These things in a given ratio for any given community form the DNA of that space. And when you're looking at that DNA, you're actually saying, okay, well, how do people interact with these spaces? What's needed? Do we need smaller grocery stores? Do we need corner stores that actively serve better food and fruits? Do we need an actual grocery store? Do we need other types of businesses? And those things are the questions you're gonna have to actually suss out. It's not a direct question. It's not a survey that you have, right? So you gotta understand the DNA. And if we do the genome of our neighborhoods, we'll be better off. The second thing is neighborhood permeability. How close, how much access do you have? There's this idea that I've been working on and writing through about Schrodinger's cat. Everybody knows Schrodinger's cat. Schrodinger's lot, right? So any given blighted lot, vacant lot, has two states that it's in at any given time, right? It's alive, it has potential, and it's dead because it's blighted, vacant, right? And the reason that one of the reasons that you see people fighting so hard not to have certain things go into those blighted and vacant lots, and the answer is always, oh, you should want this development to come into this space. No, the potential is gone for 100 years when you put something that people cannot use in that space. So when you go to neighborhoods and you start to develop, there are developers in this room. If you go to a space and you start to say, okay, well, we're gonna spend $1 million on something, on a coffee shop that has 2 apartments up top. Well, that space now is eliminated from this cultural condition for a significant amount of time. You have to address that. We have to address that as designers. So what does that look like in action? I'm gonna talk to you quickly about 3 different actions that take place when you're starting to think about this. One is through education, specifically around youth education. The second is gonna be around advocacy itself. And the third is gonna be around policy and actual architecture. So the first being No More Project Pipeline. This is a project that is near and dear to my heart. I've been the Project Pipeline National Director for the National Organization of Minority Architects for a few years now, but I've run the program for all of about 5 or 6 years. Our ask of our students is to specifically understand social justice through the lens of design. So we ask them to understand themselves, know thyself, in the context of the whole, right? So we ask them to understand their physical spaces and their own kind of selves in that relationship. And then we ask them to do stuff like this. This is a program that we call Headlines and Pathways. So we actively pull headlines from your world, from our world, from Zack's writing, and we say, listen, you've got to spatialize this narrative. So you talk about the Syrian kid that's got to come through waters to get to certain places. You talk about the Baton Rouge protests where people were funneled into specific spaces. And what do you get from that? You get 7th graders and 8th graders who design spaces that funnel people and then give you air and light and then throw you into a certain hotel. Like, these things allow for kids, specifically our young children who are going to be the agents of change in our spaces, to understand why those things are important. Ultimately, they get a chance to dig and build a full-on city with the same concepts in mind for a just city. Now, these are 6th grade all the way through seniors. If they can be advocates, if they can pick this up, some of y'all can pick this up. Okay, second thing, community advocacy. So you remember I showed you some activists earlier on. Design justice through community advocacy is a huge deal. What does that look like? So I want you to reframe your ideas, your thoughts around what protests are. Some of you are probably like the protesters that go and pour oil on yourself. That's great, do it. I think protest itself, you want to frame in the sense of what we do. We are designers. Some of us are designers, architects, tech people. We can frame our conversations around that. So to protest is to have an unyielding faith in the potential for a just society. It's not aggression. It's hope. It's hope. In the face of every other concern, it is hope. Design at its best should aspire to have these characteristics. So we want to bring, as advocates, as architects, as designers, as artists, we want to take those people who are actively community organizers and in the streets, the activists. You see my man Quest on the left-hand side. He is one of the prime organizers for Take 'Em Down NOLA. And you see him with us becoming an advocate, right? Working over a couple-day workshop where we designed spaces that actively spoke to the situations that community members had addressed. So now when he leaves, he is now the advocate that pushes this. He doesn't have to have an architectural degree. We give the power, the agency back to the community. That's your key. We allow them to understand that there's the continuum of design that allows for people to think at whatever scale is comfortable for them. So when you work with communities, there is ephemeral and individual, there is permanent and collective, right? And people can go up and they can look at anywhere along that timeline, along that continuum, and they can say, this is what I'm comfortable with. This is what I see can make impact in my community. And it gives them an access point. So you need to understand that. And what happens with that is that you work with architects and designers, you get a bunch of different ideas out of it, and you proceed to putting those into the world. So actively with that particular program, Design as Protest, we will be putting together a book with Next City, proud sponsors for our NOMA conference last year, and that'll be coming out sometime next year. So be on the lookout. The last thing, and I'll get off stage here real quickly, design justice through policy and placemaking, right? The Claiborne Market's the midline. So one of the things that we discussed with our city officials was how do you actually, again, put the power back into people's hands? Well, our process was very simple. We know that there are two different lives that our corridor has, right? People activated under certain conditions, and it is basically a tear through the center of a historically black neighborhood. So what we do, we actually go and have plenty of community meetings. We allow people to note what their questions, their concerns, their opportunities were. And then not only do we just do renderings, but we allow them to comment publicly. This is posted out into the world and people are allowed to comment publicly, and then we show that to them again. Did we get it right? Who knows? Maybe we did, maybe we didn't. But what it turns into is a marketplace. It's one that has classrooms because that's what community asked for, in certain spaces because that's what community asked for. And our key to this is that we test the model. So we have the community meetings. Yes, everybody here can do a community meeting. We do the renderings. Yes, the people can do the renderings. We can find that. But then we look to have a test. So we have a marketplace. We go out and do the Treme 7th Ward Festival that tests these spaces. We change our policy based on the interactions that happen with people in space. This is what that looks like. So in closing, this is what I'll leave you with. Stories are important, and buildings tell our stories, and diverse stories come from diverse cultures. Culture itself is really, really important. Culture is the consequence of persistent circumstance and immediate conditions. Our cities, our neighborhoods, our blocks incubate this culture. And for people of color in America, there is power in the places and spaces where our culture is recognized, where our stories are told, where our language is valued. Because that is not only good design, that is justice. Thank you. Awesome. So I'm going to introduce my homeboy. So about 7 years ago, me and my homeboy met at the National Organization of Minority Architects Conference, giving a speech around hip-hop architecture. I was like, really? But he killed it. It was fantastic, and ever since then, we've been really, really close. So welcome Mike Ford to the stage, the hip-hop architect himself.
Good job, man, good job. So thanks, Bryan, for the introduction. And took a few of my minutes, so I will click through very fast towards the end. But I'm Mike Ford, the hip-hop architect. And we'll see if I get going here.
Switch out needs to happen.
Almost there. There we go. So I won't just let the curse words drop. I'll go ahead and give you guys a parental advisory. I do talk about hip hop, and there is some explicit content that I'll share, and I will advise you guys to not use it or use it at your own risk when you talk to people who look like me. If you want to repeat the conversation, it's best to maybe direct them to me, and I can go ahead and share that information. But I travel around the country giving lectures about the intersection of hip hop culture and architecture. I'm from Detroit. I've given lectures everywhere from places like my alma mater, University of Detroit Mercy, Harvard Graduate School of Design, and everywhere in between those institutions. I usually travel with a DJ who provides a live soundtrack to my presentation. So it's very untraditional, very informal, but I will play both roles as speaker and DJ today. I don't mind you guys using Twitter. You're looking down. I know that you're tweeting. You can go ahead and use the hip hop arc and go ahead and tag me in those tweets as well. So before we talk about hip hop architecture, I'm gonna give you guys a couple of examples of this gravitas culture of hip hop and the transformative power that hip hop has. So this is a little segment that I call before and after hip hop. So how many architects or architectural professionals do we have in the room, so I understand my audience as I talk? All right. So this is the Eames Chair, one of the most popular pieces of architectural furniture before hip hop. This is the Eames Chair after hip hop. All right, so this is an artist who wanted people to feel the beat, feel music. This is Mona Lisa before hip hop. This is Mona Lisa after hip hop. All right, so a guy named Alex, he had an exhibit at MoCAD, the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design in Detroit, where he painted hip hop artists in the same medium, the same lighting as Mona Lisa. Here's Timberland boots before hip hop. A boot that was worn by contractors, people who needed protection, the steel toe boots. All right, all the contractors had Timberlands. And here's Timberlands after hip hop. I don't even need to change the image. Right? Hip hop adopted the Timberland boot, and it was almost blasphemy to have dirty Timbs. Once used for construction sites, and it was nothing but dirty. Once hip hop adopted Timberland boots, they got dirty, you threw them away. Here's NBA shorts before hip hop. It's a mistake waiting to happen, all right? Here's NBA shorts after hip hop. As you see ESPN's 30 for 30 about University of Michigan and the Fab Five and how they incorporated hip hop into the basketball court or onto the basketball court. Here's a record player before hip hop. We all know that turns into the turntable. Headphones, and we know what headphones are after hip hop, right? Beats. I hear a couple people in the front. Exactly. We got the Beats. Here's the president of the United States before hip hop. And we all know who the president of the United States is after hip hop, right? It's our first black president, Bill Clinton. I'm joking. It's President Barack Obama, who used hip hop to mobilize first-time voters and actually get him in office 2 times. I'm sad to see him go come January. And here's one of the most iconic images of architecture. This is architecture before hip hop. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. And this is architecture after hip hop. And that's what I want to discuss today. And hopefully you guys can join in the discussion. Let me know what it is that you think architecture is after hip hop. And I'll show you a few examples of my own. Before I talk about what those examples are, I want to give you guys examples of how black art has influenced culture and art movements around the world. I just showed you a few images of products, and that was something on the surface. We all know those things, but this is a conversation that gets a lot deeper. This is Le Corbusier, who Zack mentioned in his opening, and Pablo Picasso. Who all knows about Pablo Picasso's Black period? Very few people know about Pablo Picasso's Black period. Pablo Picasso had a period in his art where he was inspired by African tribal art. During that time, Picasso created Cubism. But if you look right here, this is one of his most famous pieces, and it's also deemed one of the first pieces of Cubism, The Young Ladies of Avignon. If you look at the first three faces, they look a little regular, but the last two looks like tribal masks. Picasso actually drew sketches and studied African tribal masks and incorporated that into The Young Ladies of Avignon. And he would never go back to draw the same again. On the left is an image of Pablo Picasso, his self-portrait during the Blue period. He drew himself after the period. The next period was the Black period. And this is Pablo Picasso's image after the Black period, where he's also seen with features of African, the larger nose, the more defined facial features that you typically would assign to Africans or African Americans. So Pablo Picasso did not create Cubism, but Cubism was actually stolen. And it was the fusion of African art with Pablo Picasso's traditional artistic style. For a long time, Pablo Picasso may have denied this, but what else do you expect from a guy who said good artists copy, but great artists steal? And now we have the Negrophiliacs. So again, this is not Run DMC, all right? This is Pablo Picasso and Le Corbusier. Now, I'm not calling them Negroes, I'm not saying that at all, but this is a term they actually called themselves. So in France, in the 1920s, avant-garde artists called themselves the Negrophiliacs, and it's from a French word that means the love of the Negro. And this is how they defined their passion and their love for black culture. So this is a term they called themselves. Le Corbusier was head over heels in love with black culture. And I'm gonna see how this crowd responds and see if y'all are with me here. But this is a song talking about Le Corbusier's relationship, if you didn't know, with Josephine Baker. So Corbusier met Josephine Baker. Josephine Baker was probably the most important jazz artist that we had during the Harlem Renaissance. And he developed an appreciation for jazz music and black culture during that intimate relationship with Josephine Baker. And I say intimate, but he was more like a stalker. I'm taking one of Bryan's notes here. You should go and look at some of the letters that Le Corbusier wrote Josephine Baker. He even wrote his mother a letter about Josephine Baker. But what he did during that time is he discovered the ingenuity that exists in black music. And Le Corbusier said a quote, and I want to get this quote exactly right, but he said that Negro music is the music of the era of construction, innovating. It floods the body, it floods the heart, and it floods the soul. Jazz is more advanced than architecture. And if architecture were at the point reached by jazz, it would be an incredible spectacle. So I'm sitting here talking about hip hop architecture, and you may think it's something new. This guy's trying to mix black music with architecture. But one of our most famed and most celebrated architects fantasized about this over 90 years ago. And I often call him the forefather of hip hop culture. And it's a joke that some people have taken serious. Well, when I call Corbusier the forefather of hip hop culture, it's really a subtle jab to modernism, to the profession of architecture and urban planning, because we often don't realize the mistakes that we make and how those mistakes affect disproportionately communities of color. So this is Corbusier's two plans for the city of Paris. I won't go very deep into those, but he had two plans for re-envisioning the city of Paris for the working class citizens. In that plan, Bryan mentioned some of these. He's not actually cutting my hair, it's all right. But in those plans, he wanted to provide green space, fresh meat, fruit, and vegetables on the first floor of all of those tall housing blocks. He wanted to provide residents with 30 to 40% savings on food costs, organized recreation, organized dining and gatherings. Freedom through order is what Corbusier was seeking. He also wanted to provide them with a public transportation hub and immediate access to employment. This is Corbusier's plan for the center of Paris and how he can help the working class citizens. Now, his plan for Paris was never implemented. Paris was unsure about the implications of high density living, so his plan never became anything more than a mere thought. But Rob Bass has a song called It Takes Two. And in that song, he's talking about it takes two to make a thing go right. In this case, it took two people to make something go horribly wrong. The second person was Robert Moses. Robert Moses looked to Corbusier's plan and implemented this idea of towers in a park during his construction of the Cross Bronx Expressway in the Bronx, which is talked about in Jeff Chang's book, Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip-Hop Generation, where he mentions Robert Moses looking at Corbusier's plan as nothing more than a tidy, cost-efficient solution to overcrowding and slums. What Robert Moses did, I call the worst sample in the history of sampling. Corbusier had a plan which was riddled with holes, but he had a social agenda behind his architecture. All those things that I listed, he thought were necessary to that architecture being successful and being able to help the middle class citizens, the working class citizens of Paris. Usually when we sample a song in hip hop, we take that song, we extract a sample that evokes some type of savory emotion. It's going to be the lyric that we all know. It's the hook that we all know. And we take that, we stutter it, we loop it, we slow it down, we speed it up until we make something that's completely new. But it resonates with you because that sample was extracted and it's something that you were, if nothing else, it made you feel happy. Robert Moses extracted a sample that was probably the most critiqued part of Corbusier's plan, the physical architecture itself. And he looped that around the world, around the country. That became the typology for low-income housing here in America. And it also became known as the birthplace of hip-hop culture. Now, this is an interesting conversation when you talk to some of the pioneers that I'm in conversations with, but 1520 Cedric Avenue is noted as the birthplace of hip-hop culture, 1974 in August. So hip-hop does have a birthday, and it has a birthday and a birthplace. Now we, the hip-hop generation, people born into this culture, people who have went to architecture school, are now eradicating that architecture. This is my friend in Detroit. Her name is Tiffany Brown, who actually grew up in these very projects that she became the construction manager for during the demolition. Very liberating feeling that she could prevent youth from experiencing those same things that she experienced growing up in Detroit in the housing projects. So what is hip-hop architecture? Hip-hop architecture is the true liberation. Corbusier thought he was going to liberate people, but he didn't do it. Robert Moses certainly didn't do it. But hip-hop architecture is a way for us to experience and to explore what liberation truly is. We can incorporate hip-hop lyrics. We can incorporate hip-hop elements into architecture in a number of different ways. I'm going to show you two ways, and then we'll take a few questions from the audience. I call hip-hop lyrics from the MC, the voice of the voiceless. I call those lyrics the post-occupancy report of modernism. There are few formal processes in place where we can get a large feedback about the implications of low-income housing on its residents. I worked at a firm where we did a lot of post-occupancy evaluations. We built hospitals. We would talk to everyone from the doctors, surgeons, nurses, maintenance staff, and even patients to see how successful our architecture was, so that the next time we now have informed decisions based on feedback from the occupants of our places. Hip hop is the only post-occupancy evaluation, I would call it, is very true about modernism. So KRS-One said reality. Has a song that says rhymes equal actual life in the youth. So if you want to know what's really going on, you listen to hip hop culture. Grandmaster Flash in the Furious 5 in his song The Message gives a very, very harsh critique of modernism. So if we listen to the lyrics, and I will help you listen by showing the lyrics over these next few slides, we can get a great understanding of how our plans, which had very good intentions at times, how they affected communities when we actually implemented them across the country. So this is, when juxtaposed with some of the descriptions that architects, mainly modernists, use to describe their architecture, is completely different. And if you listen to his chorus, which is very, very strong, I'll tell you how this plays out in urban planning, but listen to the chorus. So what is he talking about? The reason why Corbusier's plan was never implemented in Paris, as I said before, they did not know how that architecture would affect the people. This is a critique of Corbusier's plan for Paris that was written by a French magazine called L'Architecte in 1925. It's the next generation really destined to pass its existence in these immense geometrical barracks, living in standardized mass production houses. And it continues, but I call this a prediction of hip hop culture almost 50 years before it was born. Poor creatures, what will they become? In the midst of all this dreadful speed, this organization, this terrible uniformity, so much logic taken to its extreme limits, so much science, so much of the mechanical, everywhere, present and challenging one on every page. Here's enough to discuss one forever with standardization and make one long for disorder. This is in 1925, and I argue that this is hip hop culture. Paris was right, they didn't do it, America did not listen. And we have song after song that talks about this architecture. Towers in the park wasn't really parks. Snoop Dogg said, ain't no trees, the grass ain't green. And when I say it's all bad, you know what I mean. Wu-Tang Clan, Street Chronicle, wise words by the abominable, high honorable, rap quotable, phenomenal. Seniority Kid, I speak for the minority, ghetto poverty, fuck the housing authority. That's a song from the West Coast All-Stars, we're all in the same game. And he says, I'm in a rage because other races say we act like rats in a cage. What is he talking about? He's talking about J.B. Calhoun, who actually studied rats and mice in high-density living situations and warned the United States Army that if we would continue down this path, we would have high problems with violence and a number of other defects that he found in his rats and his mice experiments. And if we can't hear the hip-hop artists, all right, they're people of color, maybe their language, their tongue, their dialect. I sometimes talk with a country slur. Maybe you can't understand us, but maybe you can understand somebody like Vanilla Ice and his song Ice Ice Baby. These are the very first words of the song. All right, that's the last time I play Vanilla Ice when I talk about hip hop architecture, but he said something very important. We need to stop doing what it is that we're doing. We need to collaborate with these communities that are not typically at the table. And more importantly, we need to find out ways to listen and stop coming up with barriers or acknowledging the barriers. Let's find new ways of listening. So I present hip hop as a new way to listen to a community and really hear the frustrations that those communities have. And Nas, in his song, said this. He told hip hoppers, he said, B-boys, And girls, listen up. You can be anything in the world, in God we trust. An architect, doctor, maybe an actress, but nothing comes easy. It takes much practice. So he was letting people know that you can become an architect. You can change your community. It's going to take a little bit of practice, but you can do it. Here's a few studies that I have compiled that looks at taking architecture, because we always want to see the aesthetic. How does it look? Can we look at the structural stability of breaking? These are some sketches by an artist named Florian Nicole. Here she's trying to understand, we're working on this thing to understand how breakdancers can get into certain freezes. Is there a way to calculate the force being exerted, angles, as a new way to introduce youth to math? Can we take those structural stability analysis and turn that into furniture? So this is a furniture frame I created. Can it become a couch or a chair, a piece of lounge furniture? Is it flexible, just like the breaker, him or the B-boy or the B-girl? Can this furniture now turn into a coffee table? And last, I'll end with the Universal Hip-Hop Museum. The Universal Hip-Hop Museum is the perfect representation of hip-hop architecture. Earlier this year, we held an event in the Bronx where we brought together hip-hop pioneers, community members, architects, designers from around the country, high school students, and even a few politicians to talk about what the aesthetic and the programmatic elements for the museum should be. I brought together some of my friends from the National Organization of Minority Architects. We've all had tons of conversations about this intersection. They've guided me on all of my lectures that I give across the country, and have pushed me to keep going with this conversation. So I wanted to have them help me facilitate these conversations. We had Curtis Blow and Roxanne Shante, one of the first female MCs, where they were able to tell their story about how they got involved with hip hop culture. Then from there, we were able to work with people like the Sugar Hill Gang. We were able to liberate people and give them the opportunity to do things that they once dreamed about. I called myself the hip hop architect, and there I met the OG, the real hip hop architect, Paradise Gray, who went to high school for architecture and called himself the hip hop architect. So I thought I was in trouble when we met. But this gave him an opportunity to express his love for architecture and get in there and start drawing. We had the media there to give interviews as well. Grand Wizard Theodore, who invented the scratch. Again, with these artists, we were able to walk them through the process of architecture, let them tell their story, and no longer have it be co-opted or interpreted. So this is me with Roxanne Shante, where she was able to talk and tell us about her history. Then she was paired up with an architect, and Roxanne Shante led the architect in designing the experience that people will have when they learn about Roxanne Shante. So she was drawing the sketches, she was creating the words, the programmatic pieces. Again, using the sketches, she's been an architect. We teamed with Autodesk. Autodesk came in and did a free training for everyone in the room. Everyone from the architects, the high school students, and the hip hop artists as well. And they were able to go ahead and make their own three-dimensional models of their ideas that they worked on the previous 2 days. So it was a 3-day event. And at the end of the third day, they were able to 3D print their ideas and hold them in their hand. So they went from telling their story to holding their exhibit in their hand by the end of the third day. And last but not least, is the Hip Hop Museum itself. During that session, we came up with a lot of programmatic ideas, ton of people, and that program eventually led to the design of the Universal Hip Hop Museum. The Universal Hip Hop Museum is a project that will house all of these stories. It will give people experiences that they can't get anywhere else. It will not only preserve, but celebrate hip hop culture and the genius of urban America. It will be a home not only to the past, but also to the future, so that hip hop culture never dies. And this project is in the South Bronx. It's in the home of hip hop. And last but not least, we were just at 313, which is Detroit, on our time here. So the last piece that we presented earlier is the Universal Hip Hop Museum's mobile experience. During that discussion, we learned that there are some things that we need to overcome. what typically encumbers someone from going to a museum? Usually it's transportation. This museum will be in the Bronx, but it's for everybody. But going to New York is not the cheapest experience for someone who may be from Detroit or Chicago in the inner city and not have those resources. So we came up with an idea to make the museum mobile, to travel around the country and let everyone experience the greatness that I call hip hop. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Bryan. Yeah. Another hand, ladies and gentlemen. All right. Okay, we've only got a couple minutes left, but I want to dive into a couple of these questions. And
Julie said we got like 8 extra minutes, right?
Oh, we do? 5 extra minutes? Okay.
Got it. Cool.
So
go.
So plus 3.
Okay, don't waste the time.
Okay. Overwhelmingly, I think you guys want to hear about gentrification and how that plays into all of this. So the first question is, what are your thoughts on gentrification of neighborhoods, and what would some steps be to prevent injustice toward lower income residents? Particularly, I'll add, with a project like the Universal Hip Hop Museum that's going into a place like the South Bronx, which is already struggling with the ramifications of gentrification right now.
Yeah, I think some of the things that the Universal Hip Hop Museum has tried to do, and I'll answer this quickly and we can definitely talk more. I wanted to bring people to the table to make sure that, one, they know what's happening in the museum, but also bring them to the table because we realize that they are the experts. They are the content experts, and there are opportunities for them that may not be available through traditional institutions, but the Hip Hop Museum recognizes that expertise that they have. And one of the biggest problems with gentrification is the access to the jobs that will give you the higher pay that can allow you to stay in the communities when projects such as this happen. So the Universal Hip Hop Museum's objective is to not hire just college professors or college students. It's looking at the community as those content experts and letting them become curators and have a number of jobs inside the museum that are not some of the lower paying occupations, such as janitorial staff, ticket collectors, or waiters and waitresses. So how can we use their expertise to give them the higher wages?
Yeah, so I'll speak to this really quickly as well. Gentrification, it kind of pisses me off, not that you asked the question, great question, but gentrification itself is the death throes of a neighborhood. It is too late once you know it exists, right? So everything else before that is where you actually need to focus your efforts, right? And 1 out of every 20 neighborhoods that are on the precipice of gentrification are the ones that go through it. It's only 1. So 19 other neighborhoods are just poor and underserved and disinherited from a system. So really the focus is changing our directives and the metrics around a neighborhood from the speculative, which is the way in which we develop all spaces right now. It's speculative for a new community rather than looking at the existing community for the answers. And when you do colloquial design, when you think about hip hop architecture, you think about the existing community when you design something. Who the hell needs a walk score unless you're moving to a new place? The people who live there don't need it, right? That's what we have to do. We have to create the metrics that allow for communities to understand their own heartbeat.
And I think, unfortunately, a lot of this goes back to what we were talking about before, to Robert Moses, to the creation of these housing projects. And, these were not kind of like buy to own situations. It was maybe subsidized rent, but it was rent, and it wasn't like rent to own.
Right.
There's a lack of ownership that therefore prevents people from residents from actually, taking any degree of profit in the rising property values because, surprise, they were kicked out of their homes. They got ripped up by the expressway and got, pushed into this place that they don't own, and then they can't even, they don't have any equity in the neighborhood. So
yeah, and mind you, this is all happening during the same time that FHA is redlining neighborhoods, and so you're talking about people who are in a community, can't get another house, and you have no way of getting equity in a place. I know we got more questions, sorry.
All right, next question. Hip hop lyrics are often about how someone made it and how rich they are. Do you think these sort of messages in artists perpetuate disparity?
Absolutely not. I think this comes to our ability to listen. What happened is hip hop artists are describing an environment. One thing that I will say is that if we want to stop hearing some of the disparity that are in lyrics, we need to go and fix the communities that are inspiring that disparity. What has happened with the corporate monopoly of rap, right? This branch of hip hop culture, this corporate monopoly said, I hear that story of disparity. I don't want to fix it. I want to hear another one just like it. And I want architects to think differently. Hear those stories. You must hear those stories because those stories are telling you about your incorporation or your ideas and how they're incorporated into these communities. So I don't think that they perpetuate disparity. They are a true reflection of the environment from which the lyrics are coming from.
Yeah. Greedy American capitalism, that's what does it.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll add to that too. You know, I agree with Mike. I think that it's not hip hop's fault. I think rappers are often reporters, and I know that's been said before. But you know, to me, writing about hip hop for a financial publication and writing about other genres is fascinating, right? Because the rock stars are all like, oh yeah, like I don't want to talk about how much money I made. You know, even though they're making, you know, $30-40 million a year, they don't want to talk about it, right? They want to act like, you know, they're all still indie and cool, and when they live in, you know, and they live in like a one-bedroom apartment, whatever, you know. There's this kind of idea of rock as like a reaction, a movement away from wealth, from a suburban upbringing, and sort of like the disaffected thing going on there. Whereas to me, hip hop in many ways, it's sort of like when an artist makes it, there's a movement, it's an aspirational genre, it's a movement towards something. And again, there are obviously many different subgenres within hip hop, but I think more often there's a sense of like wanting to experience the artist making it as well. It's like the artist made it, and you know, I could do it too. And I think that's why, you know, stories about Jay-Z and Diddy and guys like that, although some people feel like maybe they're too far to that side, for other people can be more of an inspiration because, you know, it's a model in a way out.
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, one of my monikers or a line that I take from Jay-Z, Jay-Z said, I'm not a businessman. I'm a businessman. Man. And that's how I look at myself in architecture. I'm not a businessman. I'm a business. My culture is a business. My culture is something that is very important. And if I rely on my culture and not what institutions tell me is great architecture, I can become an architect, I can become an agent of change, and I can influence my community.
Absolutely.
All right. Okay, now we have 6 more minutes, so this is great. There's a great question here. Can we all sing along with Biz again? Another one I'm going to go to. What role or what should be the attitude of well-intentioned white designers, those of us who want to help but have benefited from privilege?
So I think for white designers, what you just said, acknowledge your privilege. First and foremost, all the time, acknowledge your privilege. Because I think even all of us have privilege of some sort. So acknowledge what you have, and then seek the people who have the information. You know, there are advocates out there. We cannot hold ourselves to only architects can speak about the built environment. Again, bullshit. Everyone who lives in this world, they are inextricably linked. The hardware to the software of life. So yes, go seek the people who actively live in those spaces if you want an answer. Hire them too, give them money.
Yeah, I mean, I echo what Bryan says. Again, I look at I call it the genius of urban, well, not just me, but people call it the genius of urban America. What happens a lot with the topic that I'm talking about, hip hop architecture, I noticed that a lot of people want to hijack or take the topic and convey it to others. I think there's opportunities to bring in those cultural experts and not be the Picassos, the Corbusiers. Let the people who have the content come into those spaces and inspire the people that look like them. And if you are privileged to be in a space and can offer that opportunity for someone else to come in, I think that's the best thing that you can do. This is not a pitch for myself to come to where you are, whoever asked that question, but I definitely will come to where you are, whoever asked that question.
All right, next question. What's the cost-effective alternative to high-density housing in a world with scarce resources and scarce living spaces? No big deal. Just
Yeah.
solve that right now. It'd be great.
What is it? 75% of our cities are gonna, or 75% of our cities will be have higher densities by 2050 or something of that sort. Like it's going to be an increased conversation around trying to build in cost efficacy in those tight quarters. I don't know that there's really an answer around this at this moment. I think what has to happen in general is to reduce demand by creating spaces that can bridge the gap, right? So one of these things around democratic public spaces is that it allows for access to those resources that are necessary for survival. A lot of times we think, okay, well, if we build affordable housing or densified housing, that's what people need, it's just the housing. Well, that's an American ideal. Euclidean planning really says, okay, well, let's put all these different things all over the place. But guess what? Poor people across the world usually need all their stuff near each other. And so if you look at Latin America, if you look at places over across the world, in Africa and the like, you see that those things are densified. And so the answer is really around bringing the resources in a democratic, publicly accessible way to the people who most need it and who have been disinherited from the process at large.
Yeah, and I'll add to that by saying, looking at the question and the cost-effective alternative to high-density housing. I think we're looking at Corbusier's plan. Again, I showed some of those amenities that he wanted to provide. I'm going to name drop here, not that he's related, but Jamil Ford, who's working with ex-NBA player Devin George in Minneapolis. He's actually looking at some of the proposals that were put out by some of these modern architects, and Devin George is putting those amenities inside of his low-income housing. So Devin George has went back to his community, and he's providing housing that has not just the store where you can go and get processed foods, but fresh produce. All right, how can we help people eat healthier? Again, as Bryan is saying, it's not just the house, but it's all the amenities that are needed. And the cost-effective alternative, I think we have to really define what is cost-effective, because if we add all the factors such as health issues in America, we can really define redefine what's meant by cost-effective. It's not just the bottom line of the construction cost for a project.
All right.
One more?
One more. From your work, do you have any ideas for reducing homelessness?
That is an extremely tough question. Do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I think, one of the ideas, and there's a book written by Dr. Craig Wilkins. He's from Detroit, one of my mentors, professor at the University of Michigan. And what he proposed is that there needs to be a redistribution of land in urban cities where land is unoccupied and often a nuisance to communities. Land was distributed in America. If you settled on it, you owned it. And how can we redistribute land in our urban cities? He actually proposes in his book called The Aesthetics of Equity, Notes on Race, Space, Music, and Architecture. He proposes that if there's a plot of land, the city is not receiving any type of taxes for it, and a neighbor or community member is taking care of that space, they should be able to own that space. There have been chess moves that have gotten us to where we are today, and we can't use checker moves to try to solve someone that has chess pieces. So we have to look at larger moves, and I'll stop. I got another question I want to respond to on that, 2 seconds.
No, you have 0. Oh.
Got 0. Yeah, it's a question, where do I get that shirt? Everybody want to know. So from Detroit, can I say that, Julie? Detroit versus Everybody, which is a great brand in Detroit. They have branded the versus everybody, and they have brought in hip-hop artists from Detroit to bring this message of togetherness, and if we can move towards things like injustice as a whole, we can eradicate it. And it's about pride. It was a Detroit versus Everybody when Detroit had all of its issues with bankruptcy, et cetera, but Detroit versus Everybody.com would be a place to check it out.
Cool.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we are actually out of time. Thank you all for spending the afternoon with us. Thank you, Mike, Bryan. Really appreciate it. All right.